Hello guys, it's Andres again, and we're going to watch the last video where we're going to see how I usually approach when I face a 4-bet and I'm in position. So it happens usually when we are playing the baton, basically the cutoff for middle position, we 3-bet them, and then we face a 4-bet. It's a not so hard situation because if you think about it, we'll have a very clear range of our opponent, is probably going to have very low bluffs. Um, it's going to be an easy spot like if we know our range. So the first thing is, what kind of software are you going to use to study the pre-flop game? We can use certainly PioSolver for a couple of things, but it has its own limitations. We can also use PokerSnow, which is very straightforward as we're just going to put the spot and we will see how it plays. So the problem about PioSolver is that of course we're going to have a two people spot. Is his 4-betting, we're calling for bet. It's not so resource intensive as it's a 4-bet pot, but there is a main problem, and it's that the fragility of the preflop ranges is going to influence a lot on the simulations. So for instance, if we are using a different preflop range for the person who is 3-betting, the results are going to be extremely different. If we use a different 4-bet range, of course the results might be a lot like a huge difference between one or the others. So there are two main options. If we are going to study with PioSolver, we'll need to do a lot of simulations changing the 4-bet range. Once we have a very clear 3-bet range that we're going to use, we're going to use different simulations in watching the 4-bet range. As well, it's not so effective given that there are still many situations from, like, so, for example, middle against early, button against cutoff against middle against early. So there are so many situations, so many preflop ranges that I don't recommend so much to use it. I'll use it just to make some extreme scenarios. Let's say, for example, if we say that my opponent is 4-betting this range, imagine that my opponent is 4-betting very low range of 4-bet, or he's only 4-betting, let's say, ace-king hands on his range. So I can do a couple of simulations. So this is the only thing why I use PioSolver for this kind of spots. For all the other spots, I use PokerSnow. It's not so important, it's easy to play, and it's resource intensive on PioSolver, while it's really light if you use it on PokerSnow. When we're speaking about giving a practical approach to poker, we mean this kind of things. Like, we can spend a lot of resources in something that is not so important, or we can instead use our resources into something more meaningful. I prefer the second option. So here, for example, let's go to the typical situation where the cutoff raises, we 3-bet on the button, and then there are two falls, and we receive a 4-bet on the cutoff, and not so big siphon. So we can go here and see what's the pre-flop advice. So it's going to fall 30% to the 4-bet, and if we go through all the different sizes, you will see that the fall is always the same. So it gives you an idea that even, for example, if it doesn't work very well for 5-bets all in, or just to see what kind of hands call and what kind of hands 5-bet, it's going to work pretty well on the fact that what do you have to fold. So if you go to the range and you go to the pre-flop advice, you will see that you will be calling with most of the suited connectors. You will see that Broadway suited, ace-x suited, a couple of them. You will be calling some of these hands. If you, instead of doing 1000, you go here and you do, let's say, for example, a bigger 4-bet, we'll see what kind of hands it's folding and what kind of hands it's calling. So here it's folding all the ace-x suited, all the suited connectors, and even all the things that goes beyond 10 ace-king, so more than 4% of the range. So if we're 3-betting around 10% of the range, and we're calling around 4% of the range, we should be folding around 60% to the 4-bet. Having these ranges, which are very tight in your mind, and knowing 1% to 1%, I think is one very useful thing for poker. So it'll give you a lot of a lot of facilities to estimate the ranges pre-flop while you're in real time. So depending on the sizing of the 4-bet, we'll have to fold a lot more or a lot less. And many people don't have this into account, and they think that it's the same like getting a 4-bet, let's say 1.2 or 1.4 or 1000. And this is the main difference that we need to take into account. The range is something that is Something that is really hard to estimate in my opponent. He will be changing the stand. He might be having a tighter range this time. But we know the stack size and we know the siphon. So once we are playing deep stack, this is one main thing, and we receive a lot of forwards even if we are playing deep stack. I can assume two main things. First is that our opponent will be four betting tighter because it's very natural for humans to realize that you are going to play out of position on a very high stack to pot ratio, not super high but high, and with initiative. So as we said, it's the toughest spot at no limit hold'em, and we'll have to speak about this. Oh, 1 second. I mean, we'll have to they'll have to deal with this, so they'll probably not play very well. So once we know that they will be playing tighter, it's also true that it will be a nightmare for them. So I recommend that if they 3-4 bet a bit smaller than they should when they are playing deep stack, you can call a bit wider because you are going to play very well, and it's easy to put your opponent out of his comfort zone. And also, it's very likely that they are going to commit bigger mistakes than you are going to. So let's say this, I recommend you to play wider ranges if you are playing deep stack because your opponent has a very tough situation. Then try to have a lot into account the siphon of the 4-bet. You'll see that it changes a lot. Try to review with Poker Snowy the call and fold marginal hands, and try to use this exercise a lot because it's going to help you a lot when you're playing in real game to avoid the biggest mistakes. It doesn't matter if you're calling with a hand that it should be fold. Let's say, for example, if it should be a fold, but it's a call if he 4-bets slightly smaller. It doesn't matter because you might get it post flop or something. I recommend you to play on the tighter side most of the times when you're playing pre-flop in this kind of spots, but here it doesn't matter so much when you're in position. So I recommend you to use Poker Snowy a lot. It will help you a lot. There are so many 4-bet spots that I don't recommend you to go through Theo Solver. Your opponents will play on a way tighter, on a tighter way than is going to look in the hat. For example, the hat usually you always have like a 4-bet together, so you will see like a 4-bet in position out of position. It has many more bluffs when he's playing in position, and then I also recommend you to slow play most of the time with aces and kings, and I'll say why. If you're playing post flop, you might feel like your opponent is putting a lot of pressure, and it might happen due to two main things. First is like your opponent is very aggressive, or your opponent has no bluffs in his range. As it's really tough to determine which of both is happening, sometimes when you are playing and you receive a lot of aggression, you will feel frustrated by the fact that your opponent is betting a lot in this kind of spots. So the best way to discover what's your opponent's range is to have some strong hands that you will always call and you can see showdown. Otherwise, I as always prefer a reactive approach. I'll play on the tight side and I'll assume that my opponents are bluffing pretty low if they don't demonstrate the opposite. So having a way to check that your hypothesis is good is important if you are going to play on the tighter side. So I recommend you to have some tricky hands that he will not know that you have, and you can see some showdowns and you can reaffirm on your hypothesis, or you can say, alright, my opponent is this kind of guy that he can be bluffing in this kind of spots. It doesn't happen so often, so I recommend you to use this kind of hands as well. Theo Solver usually slow plays in the forward pots with aces and often kings, not ace king of course. And if you're playing deep stack, for example, you're playing 150 blinds, 200 blinds, it's much better to have a king on your call to forward range than in the shoving range. Why? Because it will give you a feeling of protection that is really needed, and your opponent might be 4-betting ace x suited or king x suited, like he has odds to the nuts, and you can get a lot of value from this kind of spots. So yeah, I think this is a very good sum up on how I usually play when I'm playing position. The last thing is how I usually play blind versus blind. We had the blind versus blind videos, but still we can have a small review when I face a 4-bet. It will go here. We'll make a small review on that. we fall. We face a raise. My opponent, I 3-bet, and my opponent, let's say he 4-bets here. So I usually play the same, but it's even easier because my range is going to be, as you remember, it's going to be a bit more polarized. So my hands which are going to fold are going to be automatically fold, and my hands which are going to fold are going to be automatically called. I'll tend to play wider ranges than PioSolver recommends if we are playing deep stack, and I'll assume that my opponent will have lower bluffs than Poker Snowy recommends is if he's playing blind versus blind. Some people will, when they face a lot of aggression, they'll start for betting tens, ace queen, hands like that. But it doesn't mean that my opponent has a wider range of 4-bet and I can play wider. It means that my opponent's range for value is even stronger. So I need to be careful with that, and I need to be folding a bit more if I'm not playing very deep stack. Remember, you'll get a lot of value by playing 4-bet pots in position against your opponent deep stack, and your opponent will struggle a lot. But if you're playing 100 blinds, it doesn't matter so much. Just try to play an okay strategy that goes here on the Poker Snowy, and remember to do a lot of exercise with Poker Snowy. Review your hands. If you are playing live games, for example, and you have a question, you go to Poker Snowy, you put the stats, and you will be able to play with that. If you are playing, for example, full ring games, you should be trying to play on the tighter side because people will not have such a wider ranges, even if they do random stuff from time to time.